Conservatism and Libertarianism, Part 1. Change, Tradition, Society. The patron saint of modern conservatism is Edmund Burke. If his rejection of contract as the foundation stone of political obligation, a fundamental tenet of conservatism, was anticipated by Filmer, Hume, and others, Burke's writings nevertheless provide the proximate source for conservative political theory. The conservative attitude to liberty is not precisely the same as that of a libertarian. How exactly conservatism and libertarianism differ from one another, and how, if at all, they can agree, is a matter of some controversy. What then lies at the heart of the conservative faith? Herbert Spencer writes, "An overwhelming prejudice in favour of ancient and existing usages has ever been, and probably will long continue to be, one of the most prominent characteristics of humanity. No matter how totally inconsistent with the existing state of society, no matter how utterly unreasonable both in principle and practice, no matter how eminently absurd in every respect such institutions or customs may be, still, if they have but the countenance of fashion or antiquity, if they have but been patronized and handed down to us by our forefathers, their glaring inconsistencies, defects, and puerilities are so completely hidden by the radiant halo wherewith a blind veneration has invested them, that it is almost impossible to open the dazzled eyes of the world to an unprejudiced view of them." As this quotation indicates, many, perhaps most people, have a deep-rooted predisposition to keep things the way they are. For every person who is avid for change, there are 99 who instinctively resist it. An absolute intolerance, even of that description of change which in modern language we call political, writes Henry Maine, thus characterizes much the largest part of the human race, and has characterized the whole of it during the largest part of its history. This innate resistance to change finds expression in the political philosophy called conservatism. Unlike conservatives, the attitude of libertarians towards change is not simply derivable from their name. While their name witnesses to their high valuation of liberty, to be pro-liberty is as yet to adopt no particular attitude to the status quo, unless the status quo limits or prevents human freedom. Are these political philosophies intrinsically opposed to each other, or is it possible to be both conservative and libertarian? If we turn towards practical policy issues, it is hard to resist the conclusion that conservatism and libertarianism are irreconcilable. According to the author of a US-based webpage, conservatives believe in limited government, private property, free markets, and individual liberty, with some exceptions. These exceptions are state-controlled social security and social welfare, state-funded and state-controlled healthcare, state prohibitions on the manufacture, exchange, and use of certain drugs, state-enforced, state-funded, and state-controlled public schooling, state-generated and enforced economic regulations, state-generated minimum wage laws and price controls, state-produced fiat currencies, state-levied income taxes, state-arranged trade restrictions, state-imposed immigration controls, state-produced monopolies, such as the Postal Service, state-controlled foreign aid, state-sponsored wars of aggression and foreign occupations, standing armies, a military-industrial banking state complex, ever-increasing infringements on civil liberties by the state and its agencies, and out-of-control state spending funded by confiscatory taxation and monetary inflation to pay for all this. In contrast, the author of the webpage avers, libertarians believe in individual liberty, free markets, private property, and, to the extent that libertarians are willing to accept government at all, limited government. No exceptions. Libertarian critics of conservatism don't have it all their own way in the polemical department. The well-known conservative writer Russell Kirk has his own characterization of libertarianism. Apart from a common detestation of collectivism and of governments that go beyond their competence, Kirk believes that conservatives and libertarians have little or nothing in common. The problem with libertarians, according to Kirk, is their fanatic attachment to the notion of personal freedom as the whole end of the civil social order, and indeed of human existence. Their pathological concern with freedom leads them to adopt an attitude of tolerance to all sorts of views and opinions, a tolerance that leads in the end to their own proscription. In Kirk's view, it is consummate folly to tolerate every variety of opinion on every topic out of devotion to an abstract liberty, because opinion soon finds its expression in action, and the fanatics whom we tolerated will not tolerate us when they have power. In fact, of course, one tolerates only what one is disinclined to find acceptable. One can tolerate an opinion and yet reject either the imposition or the prescription of that opinion by force. The libertarian is willing to have people believe whatever they like without necessarily conceding that all opinions are equally well-founded, sensible, or defensible, but he is not willing to have them do whatever they like. What libertarians dread most of all, according to Kirk, is obedience to the dictates of custom. But Kirk believes that the real danger in our world is not the loss of liberty, but that custom and prescription and tradition may be overthrown utterly among us by the lust for novelty. If that happens, he thinks, men will be no better than the flies of a summer, oblivious to the wisdom of their ancestors and forming every opinion merely under the pressure of the fad, the foible, the passion of the hour. Ironically, this description fits to a T the character of Howard Kirk, no relation to Russell, the radical sociologist protagonist of Malcolm Bradbury's The History Man, who is an adherent of the leftish orthodoxy then dominant in the Academy and the furthest thing possible from a libertarian. So, according to Kirk, that way madness lies. For the final emancipation from religion, convention, custom, and order is annihilation. Furthermore, the libertarian is intolerant of any authority, and in morals such intolerance can lead to perversity. In the end, there is no great gulf fixed between libertarianism and libertinism. As if this wasn't enough, libertarians also suffer from a kind of metaphysical madness, inasmuch as, despite their doctrines being repeatedly rejected, both logically and practically, they still persist in putting them forward. If stupidity resides in the repetition of the unworkable, like a fly repeatedly banging its head against the windowpane, then libertarians must be stupid. Kirk lists 6 points on which conservatives and libertarians differ essentially. First, conservatives believe in a transcendent moral order, while libertarians are utilitarians, admitting no transcendent sanctions for conduct. Second, conservatives believe that order is the first requirement for every society. Liberty and justice come in only after order is reasonably secure. Libertarians, in prioritizing liberty at the expense of order, imperil the very freedoms they praise. Third, for libertarians, self-interest is the cement of society, whereas for conservatives, society is, in words that echo Burke, a community of souls, joining the dead, the living, and those yet unborn, which coheres through friendship or love of neighbour. Fourth, libertarians believe that human nature is good if damaged. Conservatives believe that human nature is irretrievably flawed. The libertarian suffers from the illusion that utopia is possible. The conservative knows that it isn't. Fifth, the libertarian regards the state as the oppressor par excellence. The conservative believes that it is ordained by God. Moreover, libertarians confound the state with government. A primary function of government is restraint, and libertarians are intolerant of restraint. And sixth and finally, while the libertarian promotes the swaggering ego in a cosmos that is arid and loveless, the conservative finds in our world mystery and wonder and acknowledges the call of duty, discipline, and sacrifice. This unsympathetic account of libertarianism nonetheless raises some critical questions that the libertarian must answer. Are libertarians necessarily utilitarians? Does libertarianism imperil human freedom? do libertarians disparage or degrade all human values except freedom? Do libertarians have an unrealistic utopian conception of human nature? Do they reject all government and espouse chaos? Does libertarianism evacuate the world not only of love and friendship, but also of duty, discipline, and sacrifice? I'll attempt to answer some of these questions in what follows. In the meantime, an equally unsympathetic critic of conservatism might return Kerr's compliment and claim that conservatism has its own charges to answer. A crude account of conservatism might be that it amounts in effect to a settled policy of resistance to change of any kind or description. If this resistance to change is to be something more than the practical expression of reaction, it must be based on a normative claim, explicit or implicit, to the effect that the way things are is good. In fact, it must be committed to the claim not just that the way things are is good, but the way things are is the best. For if they were not the best, why resist change from the bad to the good to the better to the best? The self-evident absurdity of this position indicates its fundamental unreasonableness. The way things are now is manifestly not how they have always been. 100 years from now, things will be different in ways as yet unimaginable. A no-change policy would commit a conservative not just to the normative claim that the way things are now is the best, but to the absurd claim that the way things are now is the best, until tomorrow. You may remember that in Monty Python's Life of Brian, as the members of the People's Front of Judea, not to be confused with the splitters of the Judean People's Front and the Popular Front of Judea, as they conspire to kidnap Pontius Pilate's wife, the question is asked, what have the Romans ever done for us? The answer is nothing. Well, nothing apart from better sanitation and medicine and education and irrigation and public health and roads and a freshwater system and baths and public order. So too, the fundamentalist conservative has to believe, like Voltaire's anti-hero Candide, that everything is for the best in the best of all possible worlds, until things improve. Ted Honderich, a stern critic of conservatism, supports the point that the caricature version of conservatism as resistance to all and every change exhibits both inconsistency and makes a disguised and normative claim. He remarks that if conservatism were simply the political application of resistance or opposition to change, it would need to defend tomorrow or the day after, when the thing becomes familiar, what it opposes today. However, such a simple-minded resistance to change has even more absurd results, since it would fail to distinguish between what is familiar and good and what is familiar and bad, and hence the distinction between good and bad change. Honderich concludes that if conservatism were at bottom a defence of the familiar, we should have a mystery on our hands, the mystery of how an egregious idiocy could have become a large political tradition. Of course, the conservative might make such a no-change claim not about everything, but only about a restricted class of things, not about matters scientific or technological, for example, but only about matters social, religious, or political. While this would lessen the global scope of the no-change criterion, and to that extent limit its unreasonableness, it would require the adoption and defence of a criterion that makes no change desirable in one area and not in others. And what would be the rational basis for this? In fact, conservatives are not opposed to change, only to certain kinds of change. Edmund Burke notoriously attempted to characterize the distinction between good change, reformation, and bad change, deformation, by holding that undesirable change is an alteration of the substance of a thing, whereas reform is, as it were, a change in its accidents, or to put it another way, bad change alters things fundamentally, whereas reform alters them only, as it were, superficially. How is one to tell which kind of change is which? One could pay attention to the disposition that is manifest in the particular change. Bad change is brought about by speculative or theoretical considerations, whereas good change is brought about by a kind of wisdom. But one does not have to be an excessively captious critic to think that this is to explain the obscure by the more obscure. Another way of attempting to capture the essence of the conservative approach to change is given by the contemporary philosopher Roger Scruton, who remarks that the desire to conserve is compatible with all manner of change, provided only that change is also continuity. This suggests a different criterion by which to distinguish between good and bad change. Employing this criterion, it is not so much the intellectual disposition of the erstwhile agents of change, theory is against wisdom, that is the relevant factor, but rather whether the change effected is continuous or discontinuous. Continuous change, according to Scruton, is good, discontinuous change, bad. Once again, this criterion seems implausible. If something is really bad, its continuation is certainly no better than its termination. When, for example, the fundamental injustice of slavery finally penetrated the conscience of the civilized world, there was only one thing to be done: abolish it. Such abolition was radically discontinuous with what had gone before, indeed, radically discontinuous with human history from its earliest records. But who will now argue that this change was not for the good? What conservative is prepared to defend the perpetuation of slavery simply to avoid the perils of discontinuity? The notion of tradition, dear to the hearts of conservatives, can be taken to encompass both Burke's anti-theoretical criterion and Scruton's continuity criterion. In the characterization of conservatism by one of its sternest critics, Ted Hundridge, its anti-theoretical strand is reflected in his description of it as consisting in political, social, and economic beliefs that have passed the test of time and are of an empirical kind, which beliefs are not theoretical, ideological, abstract, greatly general, or greatly systematic. On the conservative side, Anthony Quinton puts forward three principles of conservatism that express in another, yet not totally different way, Burke's and Scruton's criteria. Quinton's version of Burke's anti-theoretical stance is expressed as a kind of political skepticism. Out with theory, in with accumulated experience. And his version of Scruton's continuity criterion bifurcates into two strands. One, a notion of tradition that consists of attachment to familiar institutions and hostility to revolutionary change. And the other, a conception of change in organic forms, such that society is to be thought of as a kind of living entity that grows and develops naturally. The change that is acceptable to conservatism, then, is change that is not driven by theoretical or abstract considerations, but rather that kind of social change that is natural, non-radical, and quasi-organic. In their focus on that which is simply given to us, handed on to us, whole and entire, on tradition, conservatives are onto something important, which, however, may not have quite the significance they attribute to it. It is true that much of what we are is simply given to us, and is not a matter of choice. The family we belong to, the nation we conceive of as ours, the language we speak, the way we speak it, indeed many of our ideas, all these are important, perhaps constitutive parts of what we are, parts of our very identity, if you will, and yet not a matter of choice. One calls to mind the hero of the Gilbertian satire, HMS Pinafore, who was proud to be an Englishman, although, as the bosun proclaims, he might have been a Russian, a French or a Turk or Prussian, or perhaps Italian, and who, in spite of all temptations to belong to other nations, remains an Englishman. Even if one changes one's political allegiances and obtains a new passport, it is scarcely possible to cease to be, in some fundamental sense, a member of the nation you were born into. Similar considerations apply to one's family. One chooses one's friends, or they you, but one's family is simply a given. It makes sense to talk of an ex-friend, or an ex-roommate, or an ex-partner, but we would struggle to make sense of someone's referring to his ex-father or his ex-sister. In matters of nationality and matters of family, we are in what Henry Maine would call the realm of status, not contract. Yet, despite being constitutive of our identities, tradition can have, at best, a heuristic rather than a normative function, for however much something has been done, for however long, and by however many, questions can always be asked. Is this right? Is this good? Is this the best? And these questions subvert any ultimate normative claim that tradition can make. I mentioned above that conservative resistance to change, such as it is, would appear to be confined to religious, political, and especially social change. The key question is, what is the conservative conception of society? It is at this point that the organic metaphor which we saw in Burke, Quinton's third principle, kicks in with a vengeance. I think it is no exaggeration to say that most conservatives have an organic or a quasi-organic conception not only of social change but of society itself. Society is more like a tree than a machine, more a natural entity than a human artifact. Almost all conservative theoreticians, if that's not a contradiction in terms, are agreed on this point. Society, says Anthony Quinton, is an organized living whole, not a mechanical aggregate. This vital entity isn't composed of isolated atoms, but is constituted by social beings related to one another within a texture of inherited customs and institutions which endow them with their specific social nature. The society to which we belong is a living entity, a spiritual organism, a living organism with roots deep in the past. In this quasi-organic spiritual entity, the individual is part of something which has a character of its own beyond the complete control of conscious plans. It is the individual's incorporation into this larger entity that gives his life meaning, place, and purpose. As we saw above, Burke, in a passage from Reflections on the Revolution in France that is either famous or notorious depending on your point of view, emphasizes the non-contractual, multi-generational aspect of the conservative conception of society. Society, from the conservative perspective, appears to be a quasi-personal, quasi-spiritual entity that is more than the sum of its constituent parts. It persists through time in a quasi-organic way and must be allowed to develop naturally rather than be subject to serious alteration by theory-driven reconstruction. For the conservative, we are creatures of this organic society. Rather than societies being constructed from its constituents are, as it were, distilled from society. What we are, our identity, our very conception of ourselves, is given to us by our social circumstances. If this be so, then one can begin to see why, for a conservative, change to be acceptable must be gradual, non-radical, and organic. If it were not so, then our very identities would be subject to fragmentation. As Hundreds puts it, if one society gives one one's self-conception, large changes in my society, a large break in its continuity, would lose me my self-conception. Therefore, large change must be resisted. Of course, the organic metaphor is a metaphor. Society is not an organism. It is not born, it does not grow, and it does not die. From the perspective of any given individual, society stands over against him as something bigger, something other, something longer lasting than himself. But this no more makes society a real subsistent entity any more than our experience of an audience as a single mass can conceal the fundamental fact that it is nothing more than its constitutive individuals and their relationships between those individuals.